Hey guys, this is Kevin Cabrera, and today I'll be giving a presentation on Git. Now, I'm sure most of you guys have used Git before, be it for projects or homework assignments, but the way I'll be doing this today is that I'll start off with a brief explanation about Git, then I'll talk about some of the basic commands as well as branching commands, and I'll move on to speak about some additional features that I learned about Git over the summer. So we start off with, what is Git? Well, Git is the most commonly used version control system, and a version control system is just a category of software tools that can help a team track and manage changes to the source code. The reason this is a benefit to companies and teams is that it facilitates continuous integration. It allows developers to work concurrently on program. They get the ability to make changes to source files as well as the ability to reverse any changes just in case their latest edition ends up breaking the code. So some of the basic commands are listed here. I'm sure you guys are familiar with most of these, if not all of them. So the first one is git clone, and this just gets a copy of the project files and all those things and puts them onto your computer. So you now have local files that you can modify. The git add is used whenever you create a new file or you modify a file. You would have to add it to the staging area. Then you would have to run the git commit command, and what this does is it associates a message with your change. Finally, so you can share these changes up with everybody else who has access to the project, you would use the git push. If you want to grab any changes from the shared repository, you could just run the git pull command. Okay, so now I'll go ahead and demonstrate the commands I introduced. I made a new project just for this tutorial, and I call it tutorial, as you guys can see here. So the first command was git clone, and to run the git clone, you need the URL of the project. So I'm currently on the page for this project. Now the URL I can grab from this section here. I grab it, I go over to my bash window, and I type in, actually I'll show you guys the contents of my directory first. There's nothing here, so now if I run the git clone and the URL, it should clone that shared repository onto my local computer, making a local repository for myself. So there it is. I'll go ahead, jump in there, and then I'll create a new file. I'll just call it file, and I'll say this is the first file. I'll save that change. Now before the change is officially made to the shared repository, there's 3 steps I need to take. I have to add that file to the staging area using this command here, git add file. Next I have to commit that change that I just made and add a message to it. So that's where this command comes in, git commit m. I'll say added a file. Now it's committed and it's ready to be pushed. So now I can say git push, and it'll prompt me for my username and password because I haven't set up the SSH keys. So it pushes the changes. Now they're on the shared repository. So the contents in my working directory here, file and readme, is what should show up on the GitHub website. So I'll go ahead and demonstrate that. If I reload, you guys will see the 2 files. So there's my file that I just created, and my commit message added a file. Now the final command I wanted to show you guys was the git pull command. Now git pull, when I run it now, since I already have the latest copy of the shared repository, it'll say already up to date. But if somebody else was to make a change and then push it onto the repository, well obviously mine is now different from the shared repository, which means it'll grab those changes and it'll merge it into my local repository. So we move on to the branching commands. Now I list 3 here, but there's various other ones that you can use. Now the first one that I list is the git branch command, and what this does is it displays all the branches found in your local repository, but you could also use it to add or delete a branch, either by specifying the -b option and a new name to create a branch, or the -d option and a name to delete an existing branch. The next command is the git checkout command, and this lets you jump between your branches, but you could also use this command to create a new branch by using the -b option. Now the only difference between this command and the git branch command is that when creating a new branch, is that this command will create a branch and it'll automatically jump you into it, whereas the git branch command won't. It'll simply create it. Finally, the git merge command is used to grab any changes made on a different branch and it brings them into your current branch. So for example, let's say I have 2 branches, I have master and test, and let's say that the test branch has a file called test file that isn't inside the master. If I wanted to copy that file from test into master, then I'd have to be inside master first, and I would run the command git merge test. Now this will take care of copying all the additional files from test onto master. So I'll show you guys execution of the git branch commands. So I'm currently in my project here called tutorial. If I run the git branch, you'll see the list of branches on my local repository, and so I only have master, the default branch. If I wanted to create a new one using the git branch, I just say git branch and then a branch name. I'll call it test. So I'll run git branch again just to look at my branches, and you can see, yes, there's master and there's test, but I'm not currently on test. It didn't jump me, so I'll use the git checkout command, specify the B option to create a new branch and to jump to it, and then I'll call this dev. So switch to new branch called dev. You guys can see here I'm currently on dev now, so I'll create a new file within dev. I'll say this is the dev file. I'll save it. I have to add it and commit it, otherwise if I jump between branches, the file will jump between those branches not knowing where it belongs. So I'll say it belongs here by adding it and committing it. So I said added a new dev file. So it's officially now part of the dev branch. So I'll jump over to master, and there is no dev file here. If I wanted to get it, I would simply run the git merge. I would merge from dev, and as you guys can see here, it brought the dev file from dev into git master. So I've talked about some of the basic commands and branching commands in Git. Now I'll go ahead and I'll move on to the additional features that I mentioned in the beginning. The first one that I want to show you all is a config file, and this is simply a configuration file for your Git environment. So you can use this to set up your username and email. That way whenever you make a new commit and a push, others can see who actually made that addition. You could also use it to set up your preferred default editor. That way if you enter a command that automatically opens up the editor, it'll be your preference. And finally, it'll contain the origin URL, which is the location where your shared repository is at. Now there's 3 locations for the config file, and they're listed here in order of priority. The first one is in the etc directory under your name git config, and whatever configurations are set in this file pertain to the machine. The next location is in the home directory under the name .gitconfig, and these settings are specific to a user. A thing to note here though is that this user level configuration takes priority over the machine level one. So if there's a mismatch in the origin URL name, for example, then the user level settings would be followed. The final and mostly used configuration file is in the .git directory of a local repository, and this one is simply called config. Now these settings would be specific to a repository, and this one takes precedence over the first 2. So I'll go ahead and I'll show you guys the location of the third configuration file, because this is the one that takes precedence over the other 2. So I'm currently in my tutorial directory, so my GitHub project. If I list all the files, it should be underneath .git. So let's jump into .git, then I'll list the files again, and you can see here this is a config file. So if you jump into config, so this is a configuration file. If you guys hit the username and the email, they'll show up in this section, the core section. The origin URL is right here, and this is where I'm pushing and I'm pulling from. So if you guys decide to change this to be pushed and pulled from somewhere else, you guys have to make sure this path is exactly correct, otherwise you won't be able to push or pull anymore. So the last concept I wanted to introduce to you guys was that of Git hooks. Now Git hooks are just a bunch of scripts that run either before or after a Git command has been entered. So there's client hooks and there's server hooks. The client hooks will run on your own local system, whereas the server hooks will run on GitHub servers or Bitbucket servers or your own server that's hosting a project. Now an example of a client hook running on your system could be a post commit hook, and you can edit this commit hook to check whether a commit message is in the correct form. If it's not, you can let the user know, you can decline that commit, and unless they fix it, they won't be able to commit that message. An example of a server hook is a post receive hook, and this would automatically run after a push has been made onto a server. So what this can do, you can make it so it kicks off a build, so it compiles all the files in that program, and it can let the user know whether it compiles successfully or not. The Git hooks are pretty easy to find. I'll show you guys where they are right now. So I'll just jump in .git as before, where the config file was. So you'll see a directory called hooks. If I jump into hooks, you'll see there's a bunch of pre-made sample hooks already, but none of these work because of the .sample part appended to the end of the name. This is where you would have your client hooks, so post receive, post commit, pre-commit, whereas the server hooks would be on the server system, but they would be in the same hooks directory. So there you guys have it. Tons of information on Git. I've talked about common commands with Git, branch commands, config files, Git hooks. Now a lot of big companies are using Git, so it's a really popular thing that you guys should learn. Companies that are using it, for example, are Intel's using it for sure. I know they are because I interned with them this summer. Samsung's using them, Nvidia, Microsoft, Apple, Amazon, Google, Facebook, huge companies. and they use it because it makes the work environment a lot easier for teams. People can work on stuff together at the same time. They can develop concurrently. They can push changes. So it promotes continuous integration, so it ends up saving the company a lot of time and money having to debug stuff. So it's a really good skill to learn if you guys have the time. Like, the only disadvantage that I've heard, that I've researched, is it really does have a steep learning curve because some of the commands aren't intuitive at all. But after a while of just going at it and learning and looking at videos and stuff, it really does help in the work environment. So it's really a useful thing to learn. So thank you guys for listening. I hope you guys enjoyed my presentation. Thank you.